Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Burt.
And I'm Emily Harle. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we're exploring something of a heavy topic, namely the racist rhetoric that is growing louder in our society and the effect it's having on voluntary organisations. It's a topic we covered towards the end of last year with a particular focus on refugee and migration charities, but it's by no means restricted to this subsector. In this episode, we'll be asking what an effective response to racist discourse looks like and how the sector can pull together in fighting it.
Our guest today comes from an organisation that is very much on the receiving end of this hostile rhetoric. Zia Salik is the interim director of Islamic Relief UK, which, although primarily an international aid charity, has been growing its projects here in the UK as well. Zia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, to start, would you mind giving us some details of the growing hostility that Islamic Relief UK has experienced? How long has this been going on and what forms has it taken?
Actually, just a few days ago, we celebrated our 42nd anniversary. So we started in 1984 in Birmingham as, I would say, one of the first main British Muslim charities. In that time, the organisation has grown exponentially to a place where now, 42 years later, we're servicing the needs and supporting rights holders of around 15, 16 million people a year. And it's largely from British donors. So I think before we get into the kind of the depths of the darkness, we have to recognise that it's been an amazing journey for the organisation, and it's been fostered by what's been a very accommodating and supporting community over the years. But I think it's fair to say that the rise in hostility has been growing quite significantly, I would say, over the last 4 or 5 years. I think, maybe the last decade or so, there were kind of rhetoric started, but it's really intensified. And I guess it culminated, I would say, probably August last year when we saw riots up and down the country. I'm from the city of Hull in the northeast, and for those of you that know what happened in Hull during those riots, I was actually there. I was in a barbershop waiting to get a haircut. The owner of the barbershop was a refugee from Iraq who'd come as, a 19, 20-year-old, worked many factory jobs to a point where they'd saved enough to kind of open this barbershop. And when we saw the kind of hordes of people coming down the main road, he just said, everybody needs to go home. And he pulled the shutters down because it was so hostile. And I was there in my shorts and T-shirt because I thought it was just a regular day. And as I left the barbershop, across the street is one of the main mosques on that road. And the huge numbers gathered around the mosque and started pelting it with stones. And I guess that is a reflection of how the rhetoric turned to physical violence. I mean, there were people in the courtyard of the mosque being pelted with stones and bottles and all sorts of things. It's escalated so quickly in such a short space of time, and it's been amplified a lot, I would say, over the last 4 or 5 years, especially online. And I feel like it's got to a space now where this debate between freedom of expression and kind of racist and hate-filled rhetoric, it's colliding at a constant pace, and it's leading to people now utilizing these platforms with this protection of anonymity to a certain extent to really fuel this hatred. And that is now spilling into physical acts of violence and racism and Islamophobia on our streets. And it was August 2024. We saw the very worst of what that can do. I mean, I literally across the road from the mosque where we were stood, because we couldn't leave because we were on the other side of the road and the police came in between us and those that were rioting. But just around the corner, a car was stopped in the middle of the street and a family was dragged out of the car, beaten on the street, and the car was set alight. And that happened literally in front of us across the road. And that made the news and whatever else. So I think when we talk about this topic, and now we are really in the depths of how dark it can get, it can lead to that. And several businesses were completely burnt down, people's livelihoods were destroyed. And that's kind of the backdrop of what we're talking about here today.
It's absolutely horrific, what you've just described. Yeah. And I think something that you said there, which was especially pertinent, was that gradual and then very sudden emboldening of people to act on hateful feeling.
Absolutely.
And to move from maybe feeling that they can say things in an online space where they can be anonymous, and that creep happening to the point at which then people feel emboldened to say hateful, racist things with their own faces on to go into mainstream media and say discriminatory, hateful things. And now we're at a place where people will commit physical acts of violence in the street.
I think it's all of these things are interlinked. And if you look at any kind of, major crisis anywhere in the world that's been driven by hatred, whether you look at, the genocide in Bosnia in the 90s or Rwanda or places that have seen horrific violence, a lot of it starts with almost like a propaganda and messaging to really kind of rally the troops, if you like. And I feel like, to a certain extent, that's what's happening now in the UK. I think racism in general, and obviously the riots of August 2024, a lot of it was driven by anti-immigrant and anti-refugee rhetoric and hatred. But there was a very strong and clear undertone of Islamophobia. Most people that face racism, even friends and colleagues and even service users of organizations that we work with who are, for example, from Afghan heritage or African heritage, ordinarily or in the past, 10, 15, 20 years ago, of course, racism was still there and it was prevalent, sadly, but it was their ethnic background that would be the brunt of the racist attacks and abuse. Now it's becoming more and more increasingly their religious identity first, and then the ethnicity comes in. So I think the kind of, I don't want to say unchecked, but not checked enough Islamophobia, that's kind of been allowed to be amplified and repeated by people in power, in positions of power, and not challenged by lawmakers, government, and then of course the big influencers online that are using their platforms to amplify that Islamophobia. It's getting to a point where it feels like it's just acceptable to be that way and to say those things and to hold those views. And I think that's why we as a charity are now increasingly facing Islamophobic attacks on a pretty much regular basis now. I've worked for Islamic Relief for more than 15 years now, but long before that, I was a volunteer for 10 years from my university days. We'd never seen this type of hatred towards a charity specifically. I mean, we knew racism existed. My own family experienced it and whatever else, but it was very much, sounds horrible to say, but like the old school racism, if you know what I mean. It's kind of morphed into now a combination of the normal racism that we would have experienced in the past that's really now amplified on the Islamophobic front.
That sort of normalization of Islamophobia, religious discrimination and racism, we really did see that in the riots, but I think it's also important to note that the riots weren't the be-all and end-all. They got significant media cut-through because of how horrific the scenes were. Yeah. But this is an everyday reality, and we can't let the riots become the talking point. So I wanted to ask you where you've sort of seen that antagonism sort of creep through over at Islamic Relief, how the organisation has experienced that hostility since those riots.
Yeah, I mean, I give the example of the riots because it's a very kind of physical, I guess, tangible example of what it can lead to. But the hidden, to the public anyway, the hidden racism and Islamophobia that we experience, it's not hidden from us. And it starts with comments on our posts on social media, DMs to our accounts, which obviously are manned by individuals in our team that read these messages. And most of the messages are messages of support and how to get involved and how to support our appeals, and also people reaching out to us for support. But, whenever there's a post, we know that there is going to be a barrage of Islamophobic messages and threats. And I mean, we've had to report many to the police because of the nature of how threatening they are. And then there's the DMs, which are, I guess, even more private. But then there's public comments, usually accounts that, were set up last week with 0 followers. But this is the kind of anonymity that they use to espouse their hatred and Islamophobic views. But they make comments publicly for everybody to read. And then, you've got staff having to constantly, delete or hide, etc., to try to manage that, because, we don't want all of the other people that are reading them to kind of experience what's being said. Messages to the call center, calls to the call center, threats being made. And then in terms of our messaging, so we're going into the busiest period of the year for us, which is the month of Ramadan, which is, everyone sees the month of Ramadan as the month of fasting. That's what everybody knows Ramadan for. People fast, Muslims fast. But in the Islamic tradition, Ramadan is also the month of giving. The blessings that we believe you get for being charitable in the month of Ramadan is amplified, and that leads to lots of people waiting for the month of Ramadan to give their charity. So, we're now around a 60 to 65 million pound fundraising outfit in the UK. At least 40% of that comes in 1 month, in the month of Ramadan. So you can imagine how intense the teams are working to get everything ready and get the messaging ready. But whereas 10 years ago when I joined, or 15 years ago when I joined the sector, Ramadan was this time of excitement. We'd plan with so much kind of enthusiasm and joy, and like, what's the campaign going to look like? What kind of events are we going to do? I mean, we've literally starting our pre-Ramadan campaign period now. We've got hundreds of events lined up, and we've got tens of thousands of people that are going to be attending over the next 6 to 8 weeks, in-person events. And it's always a time of joy, connecting with the community, connecting with our donors, spending time with them. The last 4 or 5 years, we also, alongside that, have to do a massive risk assessment. We have to plan for attacks. We have to plan for abuse. We have to plan for our staff to be given time off. We have to plan our social media team to be on a rota so that the same person isn't constantly seeing the same barrage of hatred messages and Islamophobic comments. We have to plan to have therapy sessions available to staff that are having to deal with these types of comments. And then physically, so obviously in the month of Ramadan, we do lots of advertising, as most organizations do in their peak periods. You will have seen all the adverts over the Christmas period with all the Christian charities and non-faith charities that run their Christmas campaigns. And we're the same. We have billboards that are going up and down the country, but every year, and last year was no exception, and this year will be the same. We have to sit with those agencies and say, okay, be prepared for your billboards to be vandalized, for there to be graffiti, for there to be abuse sprayed on, for things to be ripped down. And we have to put in a mitigating strategy as to what we do in those situations and the cost of replacing them and all of these things. So these are things that, people don't really think about, but, it's a constant kind of a cycle that we have to go through and deal with.
How does it affect your ability as an organisation to then partner with agencies, have those relationships, and also continue doing what you're doing? Financially, that must also cause a drain too.
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of the fundraising efforts, naturally they're impacted by these things. Again, I don't want to kind of harper on too much about the riots, but that weekend and the weeks that followed, we cancelled all of our in-person events. We had hundreds of sponsored challenges, walks, hikes, cycles, runs, and overnight when news of this came, we had to pull the plug. And to be honest, participants were contacting us saying, is it still going ahead? Because we don't feel safe. We had a ladies group that wanted to do a hike. And, I think there was like 40, 50 women, most of them visibly Muslim, but by that I mean they wear the hijab and they're easily identifiable in that sense, and they were like, there's no way we're going to go out while this is happening. We'll just be targeted and attacked. We had a massive festival in Manchester, a food festival at the Trafford Centre that was happening the week after. We had to pull the plug on it. Hundreds of vendors were there, thousands of people had booked tickets, and the whole thing had to be pulled. So it impacts in that respect. But in terms of the agencies and the advertising side of things, I won't mention names because maybe that's a bit unfair, but a few people refused to put our billboards up because they said, we just can't risk our property being damaged. I think one of the shopping centres where there's quite a densely populated Muslim community, and our messaging generally is speaking to the Muslim community who are fasting in the month of Ramadan and who are going to be giving charity. And a couple of these places, and one I remember very specifically because it's close to where I live, and I was quite disappointed, but they just refused. They said, we cannot have your billboard or your advert up with your logo because A, we'll get inundated with complaints, and B, it could lead to actual kind of attacks on the building and damage to the LED screens where the advert would go up. So naturally that means in that whole area, that whole space, we're not able to communicate our message to our supporters. And that, of course, is difficult to measure, but it clearly has a knock-on effect.
You've spoken a lot about community here, and I'm interested in that, in a space where there are people who are trying to force you out of, public space, creating an environment that is so hostile, where people don't feel safe to go on hikes, or mass participation events have to be cancelled because of fears of safety, because of fears of damage to property or harm being caused to people. How, as a charity, are you continuing to foster that sense of community among your supporters, among your donors, and about the people that you exist to serve and to work with, particularly during times like Ramadan, which is such an important moment in the calendar?
Yeah, it's a tricky balance to strike, but I think in the darkest of days, and I'll go back to my horrific day in Hull that day. My own family, my sister wouldn't allow her son to go to the park because they had summer activities at that time. They refused to leave the house for weeks because we were just so scared. But the very following day, the local non-Muslim community came out. They came to the mosques. We were all gathered outside because we were doing all the cleanup, and they came and they offered their support. They helped us clean up. They gave us messages of solidarity. They told us that this doesn't represent the vast majority of people. And it's a reminder to us that it really is the fringes of society that often shout the loudest and are heard the most, but it's the quiet majority that we live amongst. Of course, we have to take measures and precautions and do our risk assessments because we never ever want to put anybody in harm's way. But at the same time, we're in a position where we can put measures in place. We do have resources where we can put safety measures in place where the ordinary group or small community organization may not be able to. We're able to have guides and security and all of these things. It also feels like a bit of a battle of good versus evil, and actually enabling communities to come together in the face of all of this and saying, no, what they're actually trying to achieve is for us to vacate the public spaces, is for us not to be seen and to be heard and to be seen to be doing good. And that almost kind of pushes you to do more and create more spaces and, of course, take those precautions. So like I say, when we plan our Ramadan campaigns, if there are major events now where there's going to be lots of public engagement and mass participation events, the security is heightened, the costs have increased, and that's just the nature of the environment that we live in. But we're trying to occupy as much of that space as we can and allowing people to engage in those activities and bringing communities together. I think one of the beautiful things about the month of Ramadan is it's an opportunity for us to literally break bread with our neighbors. The number of iftars and open activities that we were engaged with. We work very closely with an organization called the Ramadan Tent Project. It's a series of public open iftars across the country where actually a lot of the people that attend are non-Muslims because they just want to experience what an iftar is like, gathering together at dusk and hearing the call to prayer and breaking fast with people, meeting new people, etc. And of course, again, even with those events, the risk assessments are done, the locations are very carefully picked. But we continue to carry those out because it's important for us to, A, fulfill our duties from a religious obligation perspective, but B, continue to foster the harmony that we've experienced for many years. These things, they're cyclical. Growing up in the early 90s, there were periods when the racism intensified massively. And it took the host community as well as the migrant community to come together and to work together and to actually iron out the differences. And what we've experienced and what I've personally experienced, I grew up my father was the leader of a mosque, and his role often involved breaking down barriers because a lot of the issues that we found was purely down to a lack of knowledge and awareness. My brother, who's also an imam, who is the imam of the mosque in New York, when they were looking to renovate their building, they had a group of EDL protesters outside holding placards and, shouting abuse. And ordinarily, people shy away from that and hide, and because it's scary. You've got a big mob of people holding placards, shouting abuse. And he did probably the most British thing you could do, which was he just went to them and said, "Guys, do you want to come in for a cup of tea? Let's have a chat." And they were like, "Okay, why not?" And they actually went in. They had a cup of tea. And he explained to them, "Look, what are you so scared about? Like, what are your actual fears of us renovating our own building? You're not encroaching on anybody's land. It's our own land." And by the end of it, the second most British thing happened, which was they played a game of football on the field. And that, to me, demonstrates how if you actually engage and if there are fears, and I can't blame people for being fearful of Muslims and Muslim charities and whatever else because of the rhetoric, because of the messaging. We're constantly seeing things on social media saying these Muslim charities are a front, they're raising money for terrorists, they're doing all this. As the average person on the street that's seeing this from influential people with a platform, you'd think that they're not just making stuff up or they're not just actively lying about these things. So naturally, over a period of sustained messaging, it's going to affect people to think, oh my God, is this real? But, breaking down these barriers are, I think, quite critical. So I think continuing to engage is important. Of course, taking the precautions and measures, but not shying away from it, I think.
And in breaking down those barriers, what role can the charity sector play, particularly charities that are maybe not directly in the firing line? How can they support during these times of hostility and amplified Islamophobia?
We're quite lucky in a sense that there is a strong sense of community within the charity sector as a whole. Often whenever there's any kind of major issue, recently we saw mosques being attacked and the usual kind of cheap Islamophobia of posting bacon through the letterbox and pigs' heads and that kind of stuff. Those things have happened, and when they do happen, we do get colleagues in the sector reaching out. And honestly, I don't think, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but I honestly feel like they probably don't realize how much of a difference solidarity actually makes. So when my sister was like, no, I'm not letting her son, my nephew, I'm not letting him go to the park, I was like, why? He goes, the mosque got attacked yesterday, and Muslims were literally beaten in the street. But in those moments, the neighbor coming and knocking on and asking if she's okay, and that if they need anything, they're there to support, that person's probably thinking, oh, let me just check. Like, it's a small thing. But on the receiving end, it makes such a difference because you, all of a sudden, from being completely isolated and scared, you kind of feel like, actually, no, there are people here that care. And from a position of where you feel like you're not welcome, that you don't belong and whatever else, you feel like, actually, no, I'm part of this community. So I think the messages of solidarity and allyship from people in the sector goes a long way. But I think practically, internally, there's a lot that organizations can do. The charity sector as a whole is such an amazing myriad of very diverse people from all sorts of backgrounds, from lots of different faiths and no faiths and ethnicities and all sorts of things. Within all of the mainstream charities, you'll find that there's lots of Muslim staff and there's lots of Muslim service users, as you can imagine. One thing that organizations can do is be quite deliberate in standing up to Islamophobia and being public. And I know it's not easy and it draws attention, but I think if you're genuine, it makes a big difference. I think the tokenistic approach to engaging and interacting with Muslims and having kind of Muslim representation without real substance backfires. I mean, there was an organization recently that I don't think they really ever engaged or talked about the migrant situation or asylum seekers and refugees, etc. And then almost out of nowhere had a picture of a small Muslim child on their Christmas campaign. And they suffered huge Islamophobic backlash. And I think in the end they had to pull it because, there wasn't that meaningful engagement. There wasn't that thought process gone into it. I think that has to be the undertone of what we're doing. It has to be genuine and it has to be meaningful. Even if it's not popular and it's not easy, I think standing up to some of this and calling it out for what it is, I think is important. Of course, there's so much more that can be done at a policy level, at a government level. And those are things that we're trying to influence and we're trying to work with decision makers. We're working with great organizations like the Runnymede Trust to try to tackle issues of Islamophobia and seeing how we can kind of get more engagement on this from a government perspective. There's work that's been done on the definition of Islamophobia, which, to be honest, hasn't made as much progress as we'd have liked. And I think it's a difficult one because if you actually haven't put a finger on what it is, how do you tackle it? There's lots of work in the sector, but I think, the more support that we get, the messages of solidarity, the allyship, and really meaningful engagement and integration of work with Muslim staff, service users, and messaging makes a difference.
I would like to just briefly come back to talking about your own staff. You touched on, while you were talking about your Ramadan campaign, the steps that you're having to take as an organisation to safeguard and protect your staff. So on a broad level at the moment, what are the steps that you take at Islamic Relief UK to support your staff, to care for their well-being, and to make sure they feel able to do their jobs in this time?
Obviously, when there's heightened security issues, like the ones that we referenced several times, we've made the call to close the office and ask everybody to work from home. We've invested in quite a lot of digital infrastructure, which allows us to operate completely remotely if needed. Our entire call centers now moved to the cloud. Our entire office has moved to the cloud. And that is to enable us to be as agile as possible. So it sounds dramatic when I put it in those words, but it allows us that if we needed to, we can completely shut our physical offices down across the country, of which there's 7, and the organization can still operate. So that's the physical stuff. And then, of course, in terms of even when the office is open, there's constant reminders being sent of safety and routes to take and having kind of emergency contacts, etc. There's regular checkups and check-ins with staff. And I mean, to be honest, it's not just in terms of Islamophobic messaging and hatred that staff receive, but also staff that have been working on, for example, our Gaza campaign, and they've seen constant images of horrific scenes of massacre and children being killed, etc. And having to kind of sieve through that content, and then receiving messages from individuals on the ground in places like Gaza and in Sudan saying we need help, and staff having to read those messages, and the mental toil and this physical and emotional toil that has on people, putting measures in place to support them. Obviously, we also have to be quite responsive and responsible when the rhetoric turns to violence. Again, very recently, she's still going through recovery, but one of our staff, a very senior member of our team, was heading to the office and they were attacked, and a dog was set loose on her. Her arm was completely injured and she's now going through plastic surgery to have it repaired. So in those situations, being flexible in terms of time off and recovery and support, and mental support, mental well-being support, as well as physical support. So being as flexible and understanding as possible as an employer obviously is critical.
I think what you have so eloquently demonstrated in the time we've been talking is the importance of a powerful story of your own when it comes to countering hostile, racist rhetoric. And something that we hear a lot of the time from the charities that we speak to, who are also on the receiving end of this vitriol, is we have to be telling our own stories, and we have to be out there doing it before people have a chance to come with their misinformed, violent, racist attitudes. On that note, tell us just about some of the other great things that are happening at Islamic Relief right now. So you're growing your UK operations, and that's expanding for you.
Yeah, look, we started as I said, in 1984 out of actually a group of medical students and doctors going to Sudan, and it's terrible that we've come full circle. The crisis in Sudan is now at peak levels, and we're responding there on a huge scale. So we've always been known as an organization that responds to crises overseas. I don't know if it's popular to say, but as a child of immigrant parents myself, there's always this kind of sense from immigrants generally that the UK is okay, there's a welfare state, the government looks after its people, and there's a massive need overseas. And I think we're starting to see that that's no longer the case, or well, it hasn't been the case for a long time. We just weren't aware of it. And it was really kind of obvious to me going back to COVID. Height of COVID, we were distributing food to families that were struggling. And because of lockdown, they were not able to come out. And we had essential workers and we had volunteers that were able to deliver food to families. And I was volunteering one weekend with one of these groups, not an Islamic Relief. So our model in the UK is we don't deliver programs ourselves. To make the most of the very small amount of money we have, we give the grants to grassroots organizations that are already doing the work, but don't have the capacity to deliver on the scale that they need. And our aim and objective is to build their capacity and give them the resources so that we fast track the impact. We're not spending a lot of money recruiting people and building teams and building programs. Lots of organizations are already doing all of that amazing work. So we're giving them the money to be able to do it more and to increase the amount of work that they do. So I was volunteering with one of these groups that we fund, and they needed drivers and people to deliver. And we went to a house in Birmingham, and we, leave the box at the door, step back, knock the door, wait for them to open the door and stuff. And a young mum, I would say late 20s maybe, opens the door, sees it, and starts crying. And she said, the little money that I get, single mum, I've just got enough to pay the bills to keep the house warm because my kids are young and it's freezing. It was a winter distribution. And if this hadn't arrived, I genuinely don't know what I would have fed my kids for the next few days. And as obvious as it is, it hit me like a ton of bricks that in 2021, in Birmingham, in the UK, we have thousands of families like this who are choosing between heat and feeding their children. And I think, that's really kind of driven us as IUK. We kind of refocused our efforts and energies in this current period that we're in. And after fundraising for our programs, domestic programs and delivering projects in the UK is our second biggest priority. And our aim and objective over the years ahead is to increase our foothold and our footprint here in the UK in terms of the amount of work that we're able to do. Last year, we funded 92 organizations across the UK. We've just come to the end of the funding cycle now for this year, 2026's applications, which started towards the end of last year. We had over 700 applicants, and we're kind of sifting through to see how much we can actually allocate. And obviously, globally, with all the aid cuts coming from the US and elsewhere, means that our teams and operations around the world are really struggling to kind of deliver essential frontline services. So we're trying to get the balance right, but our priority to deliver work here in the UK is paramount, and it's important because this is the community that made Islamic Relief. Islamic Relief is quite uniquely, and I sit on the board of directors, the fundraising directors at the DEC, and I sit with my fundraising director colleagues from all of the 15 largest charities in the UK. And we're very unique in that we have almost zero institutional funding. It's all from individual donors in the UK. So this is the community that made Islamic Relief. It is the £1 and £2 and £10 that built this organization from the ground. So our commitment to people in our communities, on our doorstep, essentially, that are in need is really important. So our commitment to increasing that continues, and hopefully we can see it grow over the years.
I mean, that's incredible work that's going on. And like you say, making sure you're also giving back to that community. I think that's very striking, particularly given the topics that we've touched on throughout this conversation. How are you appealing to the next generation of your community in your fundraising campaigns?
The Muslim community in the UK is quite a young community. Over 80% of the Muslim community is under the age of 45, and around 43% are under the age of 25, which means everybody is digitally connected. Everybody gets their news from social media. That means that we have to be equipped to be able to speak that language and on those channels. So we have an amazing digital team that engage people across the UK on all of the digital platforms. But of course, we do all the traditional stuff as well. So we haven't forgotten our early generations that established the organization. We're still engaging them. There's lots of in-person events, but we're doing more activities. We're doing lots of amazing and exciting sponsored challenges. I mean, we've got people that are living my dream. They're trekking around the world. They're going to, Everest and Machu Picchu. We just had a group come back from Peru. There's groups that are hiking across Hunza Valley in Pakistan and seeing some of the wonders of the world, I would say. But all along, they're raising funds for amazing causes. So, young people are getting once-in-a-lifetime experiences. They're engaging with the charity. They're building bonds. And we're communicating with them in the language that they speak on the platforms that they engage with. A massive proportion of our income comes through our digital channels. So we've invested quite a lot in our digital infrastructure to be able to prepare for that. But it's an ever-changing space. So we have an amazing team that do all of that. We're constantly engaging. We're constantly asking questions. We're constantly trying to learn and improve. And we're very fortunate that we have amazing initiatives that engage people from a young age. So we have something called Charity Week, which is towards the end of October, that is lots of kind of like children in need type activities across schools, colleges and universities, where they do lots of fundraising initiatives, sponsored events, auction dinners, and we support all of that. And that's kind of building a real strong base of support from young people that hopefully in the next 10 years will move from the under 25 to the over 25 bracket. There'll be hopefully young professionals working, etc. And they'll have that affiliation and relationship with Islamic Relief so that they can support the work that we do.
Zia, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been a real privilege to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been deep.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Zia. And that's it for this episode. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you for listening. Our producers are Jude Owen and Nav Pal.